going to show you step by step how to make our best-selling glass art piece, and that is our cut glass cross. First thing I'm going to do is review the tools and the products that you're going to need to create this piece. The first thing we're going to look at is this waffle grid that I'm using. This grid is used for cutting the glass, and what it does is it catches any small bits of glass that may break off as you're scoring or cutting into this the pockets of this waffle grid, so that when you're done you can dump those glass bits off of the grid and not cut yourself. If you cut on a flat surface, it's hard to get all those little tiny slivers of glass away from your surface. So we're going to use this grid for our glass, and we have here some teal stained glass sheeting. We have a glass square for cutting a straight line. We're going to use that as a guide for cutting. We have a glass cutting tool that we're going to use to score the glass. We have running pliers, which we're going to use to break the glass after we score. That tool has the little marker on the rubber that you can line up your score with. We also have some Aleene's clear tacky glue that we're going to use to glue down some of our pieces. We have a grinding stone that we're going to use to smooth the edges of our glass. We also have a block that we're going to use to elevate our canvas when we're pouring the resin, so that the canvas is not sitting flush to our surface. I have already painted this canvas with a little bit of a pearl color. So we have our canvas pre-painted just with some acrylic pearl. I'll also have some coated gloves that I'm going to use while I smooth out my glass with this stone, so I don't cut myself. I have resin that I've already pre-poured. I haven't mixed it yet, but I've pre-poured an ounce of part A and part B. And I have some gloves and a stir stick for pouring our resin, as well as some glass that we're going to add to our piece as we go along. So let's get started. So the first thing we're going to do is score our cuts for our glass. Now I already have some pre-cut, so I just want to show you real quick how to score and cut some straight lines. So the first thing I'm going to do is line up my glass on the edge of this waffle grid. It's gridded out in 1/2-inch sections, so that makes it really easy for me to see 1/2 inch, where a 1/2 inch is, because for my 5x7s I like to keep my cut at about a 1/2 inch. If I'm using a bigger canvas or a bigger surface to put my cross on, I might cut them a little wider, but for this purpose I'm using a 1/2 inch score. So I'm going to put some good pressure down on my square and on my glass so that neither of these move as I'm starting to score. And I'm going to score. I'm going to start at the bottom and score my piece all the way to the top. I'm not going to stop in the center. If you stop before you get to the end, you're not going to have a good score. So you're going to start at the bottom and put medium pressure down and score this piece all the way to the top. You can listen for the sound it makes. Did you hear that? Okay, so I'm going to move away my square. And normally, if I'm doing several crosses, I will go ahead and cut this or score this entire sheet and separate all the pieces. But for time purposes, I'm going to just do this one cut. So you see, I'm going to line up the line on my running plier with the score line that I just made. And I am just going to squeeze. And I have a perfect, nice little 1/2 inch strip of glass. Now they're not always going to break off perfectly, especially if you're a beginner with cutting. I can't tell you how many pieces of glass that I ruined or thought I ruined, before I could make a good score. But they're not always, this is a kind of a texture glass, and they're not always gonna score perfectly, and that's okay too. You know, this one, for example, broke off at the end and it made a little curve, but I'm gonna use that. I like that anyway. So don't get discouraged. It does take a little practice, but you can still use those pieces in your glass art, so don't throw them away and don't get discouraged. So I'm going to push this off to the side a little bit because we're going to use it again. I'm going to go this way with it. I'm going to get my pre-painted canvas now. I got ahead of myself. We're not going to get that pre-painted canvas because we are going to get our gloves on. I was getting excited. Going to get our gloves on. I'm going to move that canvas. Actually, we don't want any this grinding dust on it. I'm going to get my gloves on and I'm going to take my grinding stone and I am going to rub that stone along the edges of where I cut that strip on both sides. And what that's going to do is take that sharp edge down a bit. Least likely to cut yourself if you do this. Now, if you don't have a grinding stone, I'm going to put all the links to the products in the PDF file for this video, but if you don't have a grinding stone, and you don't want to go get one, just take your piece outside, sit it flat onto a concrete surface, and run it along both sides on the concrete, and it'll pretty much do just the same. Now, these have already been smooth, so we'll just set those there. I'll take my gloves off. I'm going to cut myself. And now we're going to take our canvas, our pre-painted pearl canvas, and we're going to start laying out our cross. Okay, I love this piece that has the curved end, so I'm going to use it, but what I want to do is kind of figure out how long my pieces are going to be. I like for them to be about a ½ inch on the top and the bottom, and I'm just going to eyeball this and say, I want to cut it about right there. So I'm going to take this back over to my waffle grid. I'm going to use my scoring tool to just make a little notch where I want, and I don't know if you can see that, but I made a little notch where I want to break that. And I'm going to, there's my notch side. I'm going to push away from that. Boom. So there's my first piece. So I'm going to do another. This one's probably a little long. So I think I'll come up, I think I'll take off about 3/4 of an inch off of that one. And that one's a shorter cut, so I'm going to use my pliers to snap that little piece off. So now I have 2 pieces. And I want to do a third piece, but I want to show you a little trick first. So I'm going to do my horizontal pieces real quick. And I pretty much generally know how long I want those to be, but I'm going to kind of put this down and measure. Kind of want my cut to be about right there. So again, I'm going to come over here, score my little piece, break it, and I'm going to go ahead and score about 5 of these shorter pieces. I'm not going to make them exactly perfect, just going to kind of eyeball and make them all generally the same size. So I'm going to score that one, score a little notch in that one, score a little notch in that one. I'll do one more. Oops. Score a little notch. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4 more pieces. So I'll take my pliers and we'll do 1, 2, 3, 4. I have 4 little pieces there. So what I'm going to do, I like oddball-y numbers. So I'm going to take 2 on one side, line those up kind of how I want them. I'm going to take 2 on this side. And see, they don't even match. They're not lined up perfectly. This one on the bottom is a little longer than that top piece, and I like that. I don't mind that a bit. So instead of having a third piece that was all the same length as that, I want to have a third piece that is only the length from the horizontal down. So I'm going to take this, I'm going to guesstimate that I need to cut that sucker about right there. So I'm going to cut that again, just a little notch. Use my running pliers to break it at the score. So now, do it on this side since there's a long piece. Now I'm going to run it right up to that horizontal edge. So there's a little bit more thickness on the bottom than there is the top. And I could even, if I want to, lay a piece flat here, which I kind of like. So you're going to just kind of cut pieces, lay them out, and play with them until you get the look that you want. And I'm very happy with this look here. So I'm going to move forward. We're going to glue our glass down so that when we pour our resin, the glass doesn't shift and move. So I'm just going to scoot this out. I'm going to take my Aleene's tacky glue. I'm going to just put a little bits of glue on the canvas side. Oh, can you see me? Sorry. I'll put a little bit of glue on the canvas side of this glass. Then I'm going to find my center mark this way and how I want it to lay that way. So I'm going to find my center mark and kind of just press that down for a second or two. This glue dries pretty quick. If you put too much, you'll probably have to micromanage it a little bit. I'm second guessing myself. I may put this on this side. See, you can change your mind. So you want that to stick. Now, that was my longer piece, so I'm going to put it on the other side. I'm going to put a little bit of glue on that piece, and it will go here. And we'll put a little bit of glue on the edges of this piece, just a smidge, not too much. And put that here. I think I'm going to put this on the opposite side, so I'm just going to put a dot or two. It's going to lay flat. So I'm going to put a dot or two on that just for general principle. So I've got that pretty much where I want. We're going to want to give this a second and kind of just watch it and make sure that it stays where it's supposed to while the glue is drying. Don't want to put my head in the view. Can you guys see that pretty good? So we've laid out all our pieces. And we're going to let that dry, but before we stop, I have dug through my little chip bin and found a little piece. I always like to put a little decorative element where the verticals and the horizontals intersect. So I found this great little piece that has a little bit of that same teal color in it, and I'm going to use that as the decorative element in the center of my cross. So I'm just going to dab a little bit of glue right there on that so I can lay that there so it does not move. So this is what we're going to have so far. So we have three vertical pieces and 2 each horizontal pieces with 1 piece flat and some sort of little decorative element on the top. Okay, so we're going to want to let that dry so that it's nice and stuck down before we start doing resin. So guess what? I have one. Snap. That's already dry, so we're going to go ahead and use this one as for our next steps. So the next thing I like to do is take a little bit of a similar color or clear or whatever you want to use, and I just like to put a little bit in my hand, about that much. That's maybe a little over a tablespoon of the crushed glass. And what I'm going to do is just kind of cup it in both my hands, and I'm just going to hover over the top of my canvas and just let it drop. that to me, for some reason, you know, when I first started, I was just like laying out all these little glass pieces so that it would be perfect. But that is so time consuming, and then it ends up looking purposeful instead of organic and natural. So that's what I like to do now, and then I can just, if I'm making a bunch, I can just boosh, boosh, and just drop them. So now, this is what we're going to end up with before we resin. So, the next thing we are going to do is I have my resin. I'm going to go ahead and put my gloves back on, my rubber gloves, so that we don't get all messy while doing resin. Pow! Voila! And I'm going to take my block and put it under my canvas to elevate it off the surface of this paper covering, because we don't want the paper stuck to the back of our canvas. So I'm just elevating that. And this block is perfect for under this 5x7. I've got about ½ inch of room on the sides and lots of room on the top and bottom, so that if any of our resin starts to drip off the edge, it's not going to touch the block that's underneath and glue the block to the bottom of our cross. We don't want that. Okay, so here's part A of art resin. That's what we're using today. It's what I use exclusively, is art resin. It comes in two parts, part A and part B. I've already divvied some out. So I'm going to pour my part A into my part B and start the mixing process. When you're using resin, whatever resin you use, whether it's art resin or any other resin, you need to follow the manufacturer's directions on mixing, because all resins mix differently. You know, some resins you mix different proportions. This one is a 50-50. So and it has to pretty much be right on spot, or the resin won't cure well. It won't cure at all. If you don't mix it well, or if you don't measure it out perfectly, 50-50, then you're going to have a gooey mess. So basically, I've combined part A and part B, and we are going to mix for 3 minutes. So we'll fast forward through this part. So we'll just mix. Okay, our 3 minutes are done, and we are making sure that I've run the sides really well and scrape the bottom, even though we're not going to scrape off the sides to apply our resin, because that really tempts you to have some unmixed portions in your product. But I'm using a little popsicle stick one to mix my resin, as well as to apply the resin to my piece. So what I'm going to do now is just take a small amount of resin onto my popsicle stick, and I'm going to drizzle it right over the fine cut edges, especially on the little tips, and make sure all of those cut edges are covered in resin. And it's going to run down the edges, but I just want to make sure the top sides and the cut ends are covered really nicely, just as an extra precaution. So I'm going to run that resin right over the edges. I got that pretty good. So I'm going to hit the top of that, and I'm just using a very small amount of resin on my stick. You can see it just drizzles I don't know if you can see that or not, but it just drizzles like barely. So I'm going to use that to drizzle the resin over my glass bits. Make sure they're all covered with resin. Just drizzling up and down in an up and down motion over the resin. I'm not just letting it sit in one place. I'm moving my stick around pretty good. Covering all those tidbits. And once I get all that covered pretty good, make sure, kind of look at your glass bits closely and make sure they all have a little bit of resin on them. Now I'm going to use my fingers basically to spread the resin around the other parts of the canvas. So I'm just going to use my finger, move the resin around a little bit. You can use a brush or a foam brush or a chip brush or whatever. I like to use my fingers when I can. That way it eliminates any debris or brush hairs that might want to come out of your brush. So I like to use my hands when I can. A little dust bunny. Just spreading to the edge. Can you see what I'm doing? Just spreading the resin to the edges of my canvas. That way I don't use too much resin and I don't waste. I just get enough to cover my glass really well. I don't waste and I don't have it running down the edges of my canvas and then causing drips to form on the back side. So this is nicely covered. And that was so easy. So we're going to put it back on our block. And we're going to let that sit. And we're going to let that dry for 12 to 24 hours before we come back and touch it. And once it's dry, we'll come back and show you our finished product. Isn't that great?